This PowerPoint presentation is about ancient Greece, Homer, Sophocles, Oedipus the King, and more. Greek literature. Greek literature, the body of writings in the Greek language with a continuous history extending from the first millennium BC to the present day. From the beginning, its writers were Greeks living not only in Greece proper, but also in Asia Minor, the Aegean Islands, and the Magna Graecia, Sicily, and southern Italy. Later, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean lands and then of the Byzantine Empire. Literature in Greek was produced not only after a much wider area, but also by those whose mother tongue was not Greek. Even before Turkish conquest of 1953, the area began to shrink again. And now it is chiefly confined to Greece and Cyrus. This is from the Britannica. It can be read here. Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened with my slideshow there. Okay. Ancient Greek literature. Of the literature of ancient Greece, only a relatively small portion survives. Yet it remains important, not only because much of it is a supreme quality, but also because until the mid-19th century, the greater part of the literature of the Western world was produced by writers who were familiar with the Greek tradition, either directly or through the medium of Latin, who were conscious that the forms were used were mostly of Greek invention, and who took for the granted in their readers some familiarity with classical literature, which we talked about in the last PowerPoint. The periods. The history of ancient Greek literature may be divided into three periods. Hieratic, the end of the 6th century BC, classical, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Hellenistic and the Creo-Roman, 3rd century BC onward. Anarch period, to the end of the 6th century BC, the Greeks created poetry before they made use of writing for literary purposes. And from the beginning of their poetry was intended to be sung or recited. The art of writing is little known before the 7th century BC. The script used in Crete and Mycenae during the 2nd millennium BC, Linear B, is not known to have been employed for other than administrative purposes, and after the destruction of Mycenaean cities, it was forgotten. Its subject was myth, part of legend, based sometimes on the dim memory of historical events, part folktale and part religious speculation. But since the myths were not associated with any religious dogma, even though they often were treated by gods and heroic mortals, they are not authoritative and could be varied by a poet to express new concepts. Thus, at the early stage, Greek thought was advanced as poets refashioned their materials, and to the stage of erratic poetry belong the epics ascribed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, retelling intermingled history and myth of the Mycenaean age. These two great poems, standing at the beginning of Greek literature, established most of the literary conventions of the epic poem. The Dialectic poem of Hesiod, 700 BC, was probably later in composition than Homer's epics, and through a different in theme and treatment continues the epic tradition. The several types of Greek lyric poetry originated in the Socratic period among the poets of Aragon Islands and the Adonia in the coast of Asia Minor. Astropolis and Pharos of the 7th century BC was the earliest Greek poet to employ the forms of eliquy, in which the epic verse line alternated with a shorter line and a personal lyric poetry. His work was very highly rated by the ancient Greeks, but survives only in fragments. His forms and metrical patterns, the eloquent couplet, and variety of lyric metres were taken up by successions of Ionian poets. At the beginning of the 6th century, Alycurgus and Sappho, composing in Erlotic dialect of Lesbos, produced lyric poetry mostly in the metres named after them, the Hellenic and the Saphoretic, which Horace was later adapted to Latin poetry. No other poet of ancient Greece entered into so close a personal relationship with the reader, as Avicenna, Sappho, and Archelaus do. They were succeeded by Anacreon of Chios in Ionia, who, like Archelaus, composed his lyrics in the Ionic dialect. Choral lyric with musical accomplishment belonged to the Dorian tradition and its dialect and its representative poets in the period were Alcman in Sparta and Sternochorus in Sicily. Both tragedy and comedy had their origins in Greece. Tragic choruses were said to have existed in the Dorian Greece around 600 BC, and a Runimisi, dramatic forms tragedy, became part of the most famous of the Dosonian festivals. The Great or City Diasia at Athens, about 534. Comedy too originated partly in Dorian Greece and developed in Attica, where it was officially recognized rather than tragedy. Both were connected with the worship of Dionysus, the god of fruitfulness, and the wine and ecstasy. Classical period, 5th and 4th centuries BC. True tragedy was created by Aeschylus and continued with Sophocles and Euphrodius in the second half of the 5th century. Aristophanes, the greatest of comedic poets, lived into the 4th century, but the old comedy did not survive the fall of Athens in 404. The sublime themes of Aeschylean tragedy, in which human beings stand answerable in the gods and receive awe-inspiring insight into divine purposes, are exemplified in the 3 plays of Oresteia. The tragedy of Sophocles made progress toward both dramatic complexity and naturalness, while remaining orthodox in the treatment of religious and moral issues. Euphrodytes handled his themes on the plane of skeptical enlightenment and doubted the tradition picture of the gods. Corresponding development of dramatic realization accompanied the shifts of vision. The number of individual actors was raised to 3, each capable of taking several parts. We have old comedy of the Aristophanes, was established later than tragedy, but preserved more obvious traces. of their origin in ritual, for vigor, wit, and incense which it keenly satirized public issues and prominent persons clearly derived from the ribaldry of the Sonian festival. Aristophanes' last comedies show a transition indicated by the dwindling importance of the chorus toward the middle comedy, of which no plays are exempt. This phrase was followed toward the beginning of the 3rd century by the new comedy, introduced by Menander, which turned for its subjects to a private fictional world of ordinary people. Later adaptations of the new comedy in Latin by Palladius and Terence carried the influence of his work on medieval and modern times. In the 5th century, Pindar, the greatest of the Greek choral lyrists, stood outside main Ionic Attic, steamed and embodied his splendor, odes, a vision of the world seen in terms of aristocratic values that were already growing obsolete. Greek prose came to maturity in this period. Earlier writers such as Honorius, the philosopher, and Protagoras, the sophist, used the traditional Ionic dialect, as did the Herodotus, the historian, his successors in history, Thucydides, and Xenophon wrote in Attic. The work of Plato and Aristotle of the 4th century are the most important of all products of Greek culture in the intellectual history of the West. They were preoccupied with ethics, metaphysics, and politics as humankind highest study, and in the case of Aristotle, extended the range to include physics, natural history, psychology, and literary criticism. They have formed the basis of Western philosophy, and indeed, they determined for centuries to come the development of European thought. This was also the golden age of rhetoric and oratory, first thought by Horace of Socrates in the 5th century. The study of rhetoric and oratory raised questions of truth and morality in argument. And thus it was a concern of the philosopher as well as the advocate, and the politician was expounded by the teachers, among whom Socrates was outstanding. The orations of Demosthenes, the statesman of the 4th century Athens, and the most famous of Greek orators, are preeminent for force and power. Hellenistic and Greco-Roman periods, in the huge empire of Alexander the Great, Macedonians, a Greek composed new governing class, and the Greek became the language of administration and culture. A new composite dialect based on some extent on Attic and called in coin or common language. Everyone, the traditional city-state was in decline, and individuals were becoming aware of their isolation and were seeking consolidation and satisfaction outside corporate society. Artistic creation now came under private patronage, and except for Athenian comedy, compositions were intended for a small select audience that admired Polish erudition and subtlety. An event of great importance for the development of the tendencies was founding of the museum, the shrine of the Muses, with the enormous library at Alexandria. The chief librarian was sometimes a poet as well as a tutor of a parent. The task of accumulating and preserving knowledge began by the sophists and continued by Aristotle, and his adherents was for the first time properly endowed. Through the researchers of Alexandrian scholars, texts of ancient scholars were preserved. The Hellenistic period lasted the end of the 4th to the end of the 1st century. for the next 3 centuries until Constantinople became a capital of Byzantine Empire. Greek writers were conscious of belonging to a world in which Rome was center. We have the genres. Epic narrative. At the beginning of Greek literature stand the 2 great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Some features of the poems reach far into the Mycenaean age, perhaps about 1500 CE, but written works are traditionally ascribed to Homer. In something like the present form, they probably date about the 8th century. The Iliad and Odyssey are primary examples of epic narrative, which antiquity is long narrative poem in the elevated style, celebrating heroic achievement. The Iliad is a tragic story of the wrath of Achilles, son of the goddess and richly endowed with all the qualities that make men admirable. With his readiness to sacrifice all the honor, Achilles embodies the Greek heroic ideal. In contrast between his superb qualities and the short and troubled life reflects the scene of tragedy always prevalent in Greek thought, whereas the Iliad is tragedy, the Odyssey is tragic comedy. It was an enriched version of the old folktale of the wanderer return and the triumph over those who were apprising its rights and importuning the wife at home. Odyssey too represents a Greek ideal. Through by no means adequate in battle, he works mainly by craft and guile, and his mental superiority, he survives and prevails. Both poems were based on plots that grip the reader. The story is told in language that is simple and direct, yet eloquent. The Iliad and the Odyssey, although they are the oldest European poetry, are by no means primitive. They mark the fulfillment rather than the beginning of the poetic form to which they belong. They were essentially oral poems handed down, developed, and added to over a vast period of time, a theme upon which the state of nameless poets freely improvised. The world they reflect is full of unconsciousnesses. Weapons belong to both the Bronze and the Iron Ages, and objects of the Mycenaean period jostle others from a time 5 centuries later. Certain shape to the 2 epics, the social function of poems that takes several days to recite, and the manner in which these poems come to be recorded in writing, probably in the course of the 6th century BC. In the ancient world, the Iliad and the Odyssey stood in a class apart among erotic epic poems. Of these, there were large numbers known later as the epic cycle. They covered the whole story in wars of Thebes and Troy, as well as other famous myths. A number of shorter poems in epic style, the Homeric hymns, are also considerable beauty. A sub-genre was represented by epics recounted not ancient mythological events, but recent historical episodes, especially colonized and foundation of cities. Examples include Archaeology of the Salmons by Samos of Armagos, 7th century BC, and Eloquent Couple, Murinus by Mimerus of Kohan, 6th century BC, and Eletic couplets, foundation of Copeland migration in Pila in Italy, Zaphanes of Copeland, 6th century BC, mere unknown, none of which are extant. Epic narrative continued and developed in new forms during classical, Hellenic, and Greco-Roman periods. Works represented both subgenres. Notable mythical epics included the Lost Thebes of Antermos of Kolhan, 4th century BC, the surviving Argonautica in 4 books by Apollonius of Rhodes, 3rd century BC, and surviving Dionysiaca, 48 books by Nois of Panopolis, 5th century AD. Historical epics do not survive, but among them were Persia, Persian Wars by Troilus of Samos, 5th century BC, an epic in the deeds of Alexandria the Great by Corylus of Issus, 4th century BC, an epic on the deeds of Antiochus Soter, 3rd century BC, by Simodes of Magnesia, and the Thessalic history, Antiochian history, Messenian history by Renas of Crete, 3rd century BC. As the greatest epic poet, however, Homer continued to be performed in the rhapsodic context and was read in schools through classical, Hellenistic, and Greco-Roman periods. Dialectic poetry was not regarded by the Greeks as a form distinct of epic, yet poet Hesiod belonged to the together different worlds from Homer. He lived in Boeotia in central Greece. But 700 BC, in his Works and Days, he described the ways of pleasant life and incidentally described dreary Bosonian plain afflicted by heat, cold, and oppression of gift devouring arduosity. He believed passionately in a Zeus who cared about them in wrong and justice as Zeus' daughter. Hesiod's other surviving poem, the Theogony, attempts a systematic genealogy of the gods and recounts many myths associated with the part in the creation of the universe. Lyric poem, Hesiod, like Homer, told something of himself, and the same is true of the lyric poets, except for Pindar and Basilides. In the end of classical period, only fragments of the works of these poems survive. There have always been lyric poems in Greece. All the great events of life and all the well-known occupations had their proper poems. And here too many way was open to advance an anonymous to the individual poet. The word lyric covers many sorts of poems. On the other hand, poems sung by individuals or chorus to lyric, or sometimes by aloids, which is double reed pipe, were called melic or eloquics. In so which the epic hexameter or line of 6 metrical feet, alternated with shorter line, were traditionally associated with lamentation and oleous accomplishment, but were also used for personal poetry, spoken as well as sung at the table. Lambius, verse of lambos, or metrical units, basically for 4 alternatively short and long syllables, were the verse from the lampoon, usually the abusive or satirical burlesque or parodying chapter they were usually sung. Tragedy. Tragedy may have developed from the dithyramb, the choral cult song of the god Dionysus Arbus of Lesbos, who's said to have worked in Corinth about 600, is credited with being the first to write narrative poetry in this medium. Therpos, the 6th century BC, probably combining the dithyrambics, something of the Attic ritual of Dionysus is credited with having invented tragedy by introducing the actor who is controversial with the chorus. These performances became a regular feature at the great festivals of Dionysus in Athens about 534 BC. Athens introduced a second actor through his drama and still centered the chorus, to whom rather to each other his actors directed themselves. At the tragic contest of Diosonia, each 3 competing poets produced 3 tragedies, a satire play or burlesque, in which there was a chorus of satires. Archelaus makes later poets often made their 3 tragedies a dramatic whole, treating a single story in Orestria, the only complex trilogy that survived. His main concern was not dramatic excitement and portrayal of a character, but rather the representation of human action in relation to overriding purpose of the goods. His successor was Sophocles, who abandoned the most part of the practice of writing in unified trilogies, reduced the importance of the chorus, and introduced a third actor. His work too is based on myth, but whereas Archimedes tried to make more intelligible work of the divine purpose and effects of human life, Sophocles was readier in accept the gods as fact, given and reveal more values of life as it lived with the traditional framework of moral standards. Sophocles, skilled in control of dramatic measurement and the mastery of speech, were devoted in the presentation of device, usually tragic hours in the lives of men and women at once heroic and history, such as Ophidius. Euphedius, last of the three great tragic poets, belonged to a different world. When he came to manhood, traditional beliefs were circumstanced the light which claimed by sophist philosophers not always unjustifiably to be reason, but this is a test to which much Greek religion was highly vulnerable. The whole structure of society and the values was called in question. The development of larger constructive criticism was not clearly unrecognized. To him, had a great extent lost in meaning. He adapted them to make room for his contemporary problems, which were still real interest. Many of the plans suffer from certain internal disharmony, yet sensibilities and moments of psychological insight bring him closer than most Greek writers in the modern state. There were studies wonderfully empathetic and wholly unsympathetic actions of Medea and Hippolytus, a vivid representation of the beauty and horror, religious ecstasy, and the Bacchantes and the Electra, reduction of absurdity of values and myth justifies the Matra. Helen and Euphonia among Troyans, melodrama and the faint favor of romance. Comedy, like tragedy, comedy arose from a ritual in honor of Dionys. The case full of abuse and obscenity connected with averting evil and encouraging fertility. In the parabasis, the part in the play in which the chorus broke off the action and commented on topical events and characters were probably the direction ascendant of much such reveals. The dramatic element may have been derived from the secular Dorian comedy without a chorus, said to have a vision of Merope, which was developed by Socrates or Syracuse, and Euphemides aimed to the kind of comedy seems to have been in mind. A short, realistic sketch of themes from everyday life. These were written later in Sophron of Socrates. Only fragments have survived, but they were well written for their influence on Plato's dialogue, from on the holistic to the mind. At Athens, the comedy became an influential part of the celebrations of Dionys in 486. The first great comic poet was Charmides. About 50 years later, Aristophanes and Euphrates refined somewhat of the wild robustness of the older poet. But even so, for boldness and fantasy, for Mercury's invictable, for unabashed necessity, and for the freedom of political criticism, there is nothing like old comedy of Astronians, whose work alone has survived. Leon the politician, Socrates the philosopher, Euphides the poet, who is the victims of masculine fairness, the first in the nights, the second the clouds, and the third women of the Thermophia and frogs, whereas the birds of Athenian democracy itself was held up in a kindear ridicule. Euphrates survived the fall of Athens in 404, but the old comedy had no place in the revived democracy. The gradual change from the old to the middle comedy took place in the early years of the 4th century. Of the middle comedy, no fully developed specimen had survived. It seemed to be have been disgusting by the disappearance of the chorus and unspoken political criticism by the growth of social satire and of parody. Antiphons and Alexis were two most disgusting writers. The complicated plots in this way were their plays have been developed of the new comedy at the end of the century, which is best represented by Meander. One complete play, Dosatus appreciable fragments of others are extant on the Paris. New comedy was derived in part from Euphratean tragedy. Its characteristic plot was a tradition into the terms of the city itself of the story of the maiden wronged by a god who bears her children in secret, exposes it, and recognizes it years after means of the trinkets she had put into the cradle. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next PowerPoint. Have a great day. Bye.